and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 157, and today's episode is a spotlight on Fear of the Dark, the 9th studio album from, well, it's self-explanatory who the band are, but nonetheless, British metal legends Iron Maiden. So, where do I really begin at this point? Again, it is the 9th studio album with, of course, for Iron Maiden, but at this point, it is the 6th studio album for Bruce Dickinson in the band, since, of course, debuting with them at least back in late 1981 to at least early 1982, and of course, then for Number the Beast. Though, that's pretty much about it, I guess, in terms of history. And of course, this, besides that, and I'll get into some stuff about Bruce Dickinson anyways, as far as this video is concerned, but it is also considered, and it is, indeed, was the final studio album to ever be produced by legendary late producer Martin Birch, who had retired, of course, after producing the album, and that was it until his untimely death in 2020. So, again, long history again in producing for a lot of the world's most historic rock bands of all time, but this was his final album, and this one's going to be very interesting because it is, again, it is Fear of the Dark from Iron Maiden, and this was his final one, and depending on who you ask, they'll give you their honest to God opinion about Fear of the Dark, but we're not going to get into any of that yet until I get through most of the, I guess, the backstory or history, at least, surrounding Fear of the Dark. So, all I can do right here is, since this album was recorded at least from 1991 to April of 1992 at the Barnyard in Essex, England, with, of course, the late Martin Birch and, of course, Steve Harris helped, mostly, who worked out at least because of was it right here? I'm going to read the history at least on Wikipedia. I'm going to read this here because I think it hams down at least the I don't know if I meant to say maybe ham down, but it at least hammers down some of the more bullet points surrounding the overall the background surrounding Fear of the Dark. So here we go. After recording its predecessor 1990's No Prayer for the Dying in a barn on Steve Harris's property with the Rolling Stones mobile studio, which led to negative results for this album, and Harris had the building converted into a proper studio, christened the Barnyard. Bruce Dickinson had described the results as a slight improvement because Martin came in and supervised the sound, again, meaning Martin Birch. But there was big limitations on that studio simply because of its physical size, things like that. Actually ended up not too bad, but, you know, a little bit under par. So those were quotes from Bruce Dickinson. So there we go. So that's pretty much at least the overall recording process and the background for the album. Eventually, the album gets at least mixed sometime in at least, well, I guess it didn't take too much time to mix it because, again, just by the next month, through EMI Records, and I guess Capitol and the United States and around the other, like America and maybe Canada, it gets released on May 11th of 1992, and we pretty much get what was the final studio album for Martin Birch producing, and what would become the final studio album, or the last studio album from Iron Maiden to be at least featuring Bruce Dickinson as the vocalist. And I'll get into some of his overall thoughts surrounding, just at least try and paraphrase his thoughts on what was going through his mind when it came to the decision of leaving Iron Maiden after, of course, the Fear of the Dark album and during its tour. So I guess from here on out, we can just get into the overall, the songs for the album and everything. I guess I can maybe talk about the artwork maybe for the album, which is probably one of my absolute favorite aspects, really, of the album in general, is just the artwork. I think it's one of the most badass artworks anyways, and it was done by a guy named Melvin Grant. So he did, of course, artwork here, and he did, I think, again, since he pretty much replaced Derek Riggs, who, of course, had been doing the artwork for Iron Maiden since the debut album, and the last one he had ever did for Iron Maiden was, at least that was ever published for an Iron Maiden album, was No Prayer for the Dying, and that led to a lot of dispute between the band, at least even also the manager Rod Smallwood, over the fact that Rod did not like the depiction of himself, just his own likeness on that album cover, where he, I guess, chewed out Derek Riggs, and of course even that, and that again, it created a whole big problem, and of course there was a little bit of, I guess, tension between Derek Riggs and Steve Harris, and where it killed the relationship between Derek Riggs and Iron Maiden. So, with No Prayer for the Dying being the final album that Derek Riggs had ever did artwork for, and this being the first album with someone else's likelihood, at least, drawing and coming up with at least the overall stylings for Eddie himself on these album covers. So I guess that's pretty much about it. Let me just get into the actual track list for the album. Since we have at least about 12 songs here, it all clocked in at the length of, according to Wikipedia, it says 57 and 58 minutes. That's kind of horse caca, because the overall actual length for the album itself is actually 58 minutes and 34 seconds or 37 on my copy, which of course is a 1998 remaster from Sanctuary, and from Sanctuary, it at least clocks in at the length of 58 minutes and 34 seconds. So these 12 songs are beginning with Be Quick or Be Dead, From Here to Eternity, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, Fear is the Key, Childhood's End, Wasting Love, The Fugitive, Chains of Misery, The Apparition, Judas Be My Guide, Weekend Warrior, and finally ending with the title track. So there it is, and of course the title track is the longest song on the actual album. Of course, speaking of the long aspects about the album, this does mark the first, I guess, real long album from Iron Maiden, because after this one, Steve Harris and the rest of the guys would forever continue on with the overall concept of just making absolute long records. Of course, by nowadays standards, this might be one of the more considered slightly shorter albums, one of the last shorter full albums that aren't a fucking 2-disc copy to begin with, like again with the Book of Souls and Senjutsu. This album, of course, still remains as at least as one disc, one of the last at least short album, even though this really marked the beginning of the more really long albums, because this was it. Because again, then after this one, whatever. You pretty much know the history anyways about Iron Maiden to begin with. So let's just get into the actual album itself, and I guess depending on the overall reactions that people will probably give out on what they felt about Fear of the Dark from Iron Maiden, because depending on who, and I've been through discussions on forums about the overall opinions of Fear of the Dark, and I've seen everyone else's opinions about this one at this point. You can read reviews about this album, and sometimes it really does depend on who you end to ask, because there's at least very many different sides when it comes to this one. There's not just two sides. There's very many different sides to at least point of views for the album. You'll get some people that actually say it's a really good album. You'll get some people that say it's one of the more underrated albums. You'll say that is definitely was a more slight, a step back in the right direction after No Prayer for the Dying, meaning it was a step up from No Prayer for the Dying. Now, if you were to ask a few other people, they will definitely have some different opinions. Some you probably would expect to begin with. That being, they say the album is absolute shit. They think it sucks. They definitely probably think it's not really a horrible record, but it's not one of their best albums. You'll definitely, of course, say that it is one of the worst, yada, yada, yada. Those, at least, are the reactions you'll get, at least when it comes to it. I mean, it's a little similar to the reactions, at least, that you would get when it came to No Prayer for the Dying, especially when you're discussing about that album, but not to that much of a degree. Actually, maybe to the same degree. It really depends on who you're going to ask. Me personally, since this is my video, this is my thoughts, I'm going to tell you my absolute, honest thoughts about this. And I know some will say, oh, they're saying your honest thoughts. That means they probably never really meant that to begin with. Sometimes that might be BS, but I'm not going to BS with you because these have been my thoughts about the album for the longest. I mean, you can go on to a few different forums I've been on, except for the Force of Steel. You can't find that forum now. It's now defunct. So there is that. But still, the forums I've ever been on, and if you were a part of those forums and I've seen my overall thoughts about Fear of the Dark, my thoughts have always been that this is probably one of my favorite albums from Iron Maiden. I don't know what it is about this album, but there's just something about it that I just like. I have to like it more compared to some of the previous other ones past, like Power Slave, for example, like Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. I think those are fine albums, though I actually would give the slight edge to Seventh Son of a Seventh Son just because I don't think it's nearly as boring as Somewhere in Time. I think that album is just absolute boring. I think it's one of the first real boring albums, I think, from Iron Maiden, because I used to say the same things about Peace of Mind, but I've grown to really actually like Peace of Mind, whereas Somewhere in Time, I guess you can say my mind was somewhere in time when listening to that one, and it wanders into time when listening to it because it will get my attention for a bit there, especially for those first three songs, but then after that, it wanders off into nowhere land, and I can't really give you a real honest opinion or just overall honest thought on why that is, but there's just something about Somewhere in Time that just does not do anything for me. Whereas Seventh Son of Seventh Son somehow does, even though I hate the production on that one just as much. I think the production on No Prayer for the Dying is not nearly as better, but at least there was something there. Oh yeah, and I'm also forgetting, this is the first album with, or at least second album with Janet Gers on guitar on this one, and making it also the third Iron Maiden album without Adrian Smith, because the first one without Adrian Smith was the debut album. So let's definitely forget that one, especially if you ask certain other people, they'll say, oh yeah, the reason why Fear of the Dark and No Prayer for the Dying and some of the other ones from the 90s suck is because Adrian Smith wasn't on it. Let me guess, do you love the first album? You probably do. And Adrian Smith was not a member of the band yet for the debut album. He was still playing with Urchin. Fucking idiots. Still though, I digress. Still, they'll give you some aspects of why they dislike the album, and one of the main ones is usually going to be is that they hate how Bruce Dickinson sounds on the album. To be honest with you, this is probably this is the second time, of course, where he's really used this more really raspy register, where he's almost kind of trying to go for a little bit of a Brian Johnson kind of feel, a little bit to his pedigree here, just his overall degree and range. But at the same time, he's used this kind of delivery before, and that was in Samson, especially on plenty of songs off of the Shock Tactics album, which was the final album that Bruce Dickinson had recorded with Samson, and he used that same kind of vocal delivery anyways on that, the more really raspy, almost Brian Johnson-esque sort of vocals there. He really kind of used that to his degree there with Samson on Shock Tactics, but here, and of course began with No Prayer for the Dying, he went full-fledged for it. And some will say that's why they hate this album, and No Prayer for the Dying for that matter as well. But those are actually one of the aspects I actually like about it, because of it actually, I'd say, was a step up, because of sometimes I think it gets a little bit monotonous when you're just using the same sort of high, almost operatic, register that he had been using since, I guess, Peace of Mind or Power Slave, even though he wasn't too bad on those. But Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son of Seventh Son, he just went overboard, where I think it began sounding a little too much like a parody of what he was sounding before, like what people think Bruce Dickinson's voice sounds like compared to when you actually do hear albums that he's ever sang on. So I think he ended up becoming a parody of his own self, instead of actually just being, I mean, now people will say this was comical of him sounding this raspy, but really personally, I think it was a bit of a different change. I think it was, needed for at least Iron Maiden, because of the last thing you kind of need is to almost feel like you're recording the same record again, and I think they found a way to kind of run around that a bit. But still, those are considered other aspects. Some of it is that some people think they went a little bit, they tried too hard to be heavy in a way, because Judas Priest released Painkiller 2 years prior, and of course you got like Megadeth still releasing albums, and Metallica releasing the Black Album. So when everyone basically went and reinvented themselves by the 90s, I guess some people pretty much accused them of trying to, Iron Maiden, of trying to do a similar path, a little bit marching down that, trying to reinvent themselves in the 90s, may make them at least more street sounding. Again, not like they were in that mindset to begin with, because of they actually kind of were a street level band to begin with, from at least when Paul Di'Anno was in the band. And I think that was an idea of theirs, was to kind of slightly go back to what they were, at least with the first two albums in a way, like, again, the debut album and Killers. And to extent maybe Number of the Beast, where at least some of that was kind of left over on to that album, where it's like, again, trying to be more street level, again, how there was with the early new wave or British heavy metal movement. Some say that I would say they did, I think, a much better job in creating a more, what would be an early 90s version of at least a street level sort of Iron Maiden sound of their early 80s. So I think they did a fine job at that, and that's really heard on songs like, for example, like Be Quick or Be Dead. Even The Fugitive kind of comes to mind as well. Chains of Misery. Weekend Warriors kind of goes for more of an AC/DC kind of feel going on to it. It definitely is the closest I think Iron Maiden has gotten to really making a song that kind of has that almost AC/DC strut and staccato and overall vibe to it. But you do have at least some songs that still sound like classic Iron Maiden, and that's definitely, for example, like Afraid to Choose Strangers, The Apparition, Judas Be My Guide, which is definitely a more melodic song, but it works, and of course the title track. These, I think, are definitely ones. The only ones I think I've seen people really knock this album for, and especially Iron Maiden, is recording what I guess is considered one of the first ballads, which is bullshit. Even though, yes, it is definitely an album, the album's only ballad on here, again, Wasting Love. And I think it's a very fine ballad. It is, I know the Wikipedia says their first power ballad, but that's only if you really consider this more like a hair metal kind of ballad, which is not really that. I think, as again, you're stretching that a bit. You're just using that just because of you probably heard other bands like White Lion and Warrant and Winger and those kind of bands, that were doing the power ballad stuff, and maybe Motley Crue and Poison and and yada yada yada. It's like, yeah, it does have its ballad aspects, but it's not nearly that big of a difference from some of the other ballads they've ever written. Yes, it's not like the more, I guess, kind of proggy kind of ballads that they would kind of write for like the early days, Killers had its fair share of at least of one ballad, and the first album also had one as well. But they're very much influenced by the more, almost early prog rock kind of bands, almost British rock bands of the early 70s. So it had that inspiration. This one is just trying to make a ballad that is still at least an Iron Maiden's attempt at a ballad, and I think it sounds like that. But that's really not a bad thing, because I really can't say this is anywhere, of a ballad from anything else as any sort of classic metal band has ever written. So say what you will, I don't think it's really that bad of a song to begin with. I actually kind of dig it. So there's at least plenty of aspects here that I have no problem with. I think compared to No Prayer for the Dying, I think these sounded at least more developed. Even though I don't think No Prayer for the Dying was a bad album. I've already covered No Prayer for the Dying already on this channel, and I've got some honest thoughts about that one, but they're not bad honest thoughts. But I do think this was a much more of a better album compared to No Prayer for the Dying. But and I think it's a good album. I actually do think this is probably more of a better record than some of the ones they were releasing after Power Slave. And I know I'm in the minority for that, but I'm fine with being in the minority. I don't really care if I'm in the majority of the folks. That's not my goal. My goal is to give you my thoughts of what I like, not what everyone else is like. I think music ends up being boring if you like what everyone else is like. I think it tends to be boring. It's more interesting when you actually hear somebody who gives their different opinion of what they actually think, instead of going about, oh yeah, I think what that other guy thinks, and then the next me, I think what the neighbor thinks. That to me is boring. If you think that's actually being accurate, then I think there's something wrong with your brain there. Okay. But that's just my overall real honest thoughts on the album. I can go on about, let's say some of the songs, Be Quick or Be Dead is definitely one of the more heavier songs off the album. Definitely one of the faster ones in a long time that they have written. And I think it's still the last of the really fast, heavy songs they ever wrote. And I think it's one of their best songs. It's a freaking great track. Other thing to kind of bring up, though, about Fear of the Dark here is that the song Afraid to Shoot Strangers is a political song, especially apparently from the point of view of a soldier in the Gulf War. Dickinson, of course, would often introduce the song as an anti-war narrative, and he's not wrong, because it very much is very anti-war in its own right. And in some way, I think it's still relevant to this day. The song Fear is the Key is a very interesting one, because this one is actually about the fear in sexual relationships resulting from AIDS. Weird, but the thing is that what makes it more a little bit coincidental was that the song was written around the time when the band learned about the death of, again, Freddie Mercury of Queen. And Dickinson apparently affirmed that there's a line in Fear of the Key that goes, nobody cares till somebody famous dies, and that's quite sadly true. As long as the virus was confined to homosexuals or drug addicts, nobody gave a shit. It's only when celebrities started to die that the masses began to feel concerned. And apparently the song Wicked Warrior is about football hooliganism. That's kind of funny, but the kind of point, I guess, the kind of comment on Bruce Dickinson's thoughts about I guess the overall concept of fear is the key, is that he isn't completely wrong in this aspect too, is because of it's very similar to another song written by another legendary heavy metal band who's now going into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's Judas Priest. They did a song called Heroes End, and it was off of Stained Class. It dealt with the same kind of themes that, in a way, Fear is the Key kind of talked about, even though instead of being based around the overall, I guess, concept of celebrities dying of sexual diseases, basically STDs, but it just dealt with the same idea about how, for example, let's say making references like Jimi Hendrix, or Janis Joplin or whatever, who ends up passing away, but before they did, they were just considered just every other musician that's just making it into the world. But the minute that they're dead, they get immortalized in afterlife in a way. They end up, it's like now you're gonna make them put them on a much more bigger pedestal than you ever did when they were alive. A very similar situation also when actor Heath Ledger had died. Nobody wanted to give the guy a freaking Oscar until he ended up passing away after, of course, being in the Dark Knight movie. So it's like now you actually care to give somebody that sort of reputation. Now you want to give them that that kind of, I guess, respect, even though it's still disrespectful. But now you're going to do that for that person, even though they had just died. Same thing with when it comes to, let's say, a wrestling promotion like the WWE. Leon White, famous again, known as Vader. The only time he ever got to be on at least the Hall of Fame stage was to induct Stan Hansen. But by a year or so later, when it's learned that he was terminally ill and was pretty much close to dying, you got Mick Foley going on social media pleading with the company to at least give him his Hall of Fame moment and induct him when at least he's still alive, which didn't happen, and they finally went and inducted him into the Hall of Fame this year, just 2 years after he had died. So that's what I think lines and songs like Heroes End from Judas Priest and Fear is the Key from Iron Maiden kind of spark, is just the overall the overall debate and the discussion of at least whether it be a Hollywood or anything, and just the overall public, the news, whatever your definition is on putting somebody on a higher pedestal after they had just died, when you never did it to them, before, when you never really treated them that same way. But that's just, sadly, it's just how it is. And I think songs like that just sparks up that kind of discussion. I think they always are worth discussing about on why do any, at least modern times still, why do people still do that? So I think songs like Fear is the Key and that, I think, does a great way of overall discussing that. It addresses that in a very, at least very blunt but very honest and truthful way. So that's all I can say about that. Really, I think I could go on and on about at least some of the songs on here, but I think those are great bullet points there, and I think are very much great there. So that's about I'm gonna do at least there. So that's about it. I think it's a great album to begin with, and I think it's one of my absolute favorites from Iron Maiden. Some will disagree with that, but that's fine. You don't have to agree with everything that I say. You can disagree with everything that I say. I'm not gonna hound you for that. I think it's just, again, I want to be able to share my personal opinions and give you my personal thoughts. That's why I got this channel, to give you my personal thoughts. That's about it. So there it is, Fear the Dark. So after this album, they, of course, again, the tour and everything for it. But during that whole tour is where those at least was some thoughts that was that was running around Bruce Dickinson's mind about, does he want to do Iron Maiden for this much longer? How does it feel like to do, what does it feel like to actually be in a band that isn't Iron Maiden? Is there anything live outside of Iron Maiden? That's what were all the thoughts that were running through his head at the time of the tour and everything. And he was thinking, can he still do it? You know, because I'm just running off at least an interview that was very recent that Bruce Dickinson had did, where someone had asked him about why he had left Iron Maiden after the Fear of the Dark album. And again, he said he had been at this point, he had been in Iron Maiden for this long, and he pretty much felt like, what does it feel like to actually do anything outside of the band? Is there anything, life without it? How does it feel to be in a band that isn't Iron Maiden? And that's what, basically paraphrasing some of his thoughts, and that's what he was feeling at the time when he was, before making the decision to leave Iron Maiden. And again, he had been in at least plenty of bands before Iron Maiden. Again, I just mentioned Samson in this video. But the minute he had joined Iron Maiden, he was pretty much, at this point, he was made into being a superstar in a way, like almost bigger than life. And I think in a way, it just made him feel like, is there anything outside of Iron Maiden anymore? So he chose to do it because he wanted to see how it felt to do stuff outside of the band and maybe, get a much better feel of it then. So that's what was the main reason for why he left. Not so much that he wanted to pursue a solo career, but more so to at least take at least a really long vacation and a very extensive vacation from Iron Maiden, so he can once again feel like how it is to be out of Iron Maiden and really to be in other things, do other projects. So that was his main reason. Nothing to do with the fact that he was maybe butting heads with any of the band members. It was more so, what does it feel like to be out of Iron Maiden? What does it feel like to do something else besides Iron Maiden? That was about it. So, and eventually he did. Again, he did that, and that really kind of, I guess, it really sparked a little bit of controversy and some debate on, can anyone else replace Bruce Dickinson and Iron Maiden? I guess in many ways, many people got a bit of that answer by 1995. And that, of course, leads into the Blaze Bayley era, which only lasted for 2 albums, and at least from 1995 to 2000, or 1999 at least. So it lasted for pretty much the most part of the 90s there. So that's pretty much it there. That's pretty much the overall backstory, my overall thoughts on Fear of the Dark there. Maybe at some point I might cover the X Factor, but who knows when. So that's about it. Again, Fear of the Dark, 9th studio album from Iron Maiden. Again, reaching its 30th anniversary, which I think was fitting because of just in a few days, it is going to reach its 30th anniversary, and I think it was a very good time to really talk about this album and give you my overall opinions about it. So there we go. Again, if you have, let's say, any sort of honest thoughts about Fear of the Dark, whether that be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comments section below. So, but if you have never listened to Fear of the Dark and you're kind of curious about the 90s period of Iron Maiden, since you probably are just getting into Iron Maiden, or you probably are looking to get into them, this won't be my first album you probably would be I would give you, but I think it is more definitely worth a listen. But that's only when you feel like listening to this album. I really like this one, but I know that many people may not care for this album as much. So I'm at least going to be very much respectful of everyone else's thoughts about this album. But at the same time, I hope you do the same for me and not just completely hound me and saying, oh my God, why would you like that album? Don't do that. Don't be a dick. So that's about it. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed This is Heavy Thrash Jet saying I'm out. Now see you all later. Take care, everyone.